There we go. All right, now it's not as horrible. Okay, to start off with, my name is Peter Clody. I am I am a front-end developer at Packback Books. We are an electronic textbook rental service. We're also branching now into online discussion forums centered around the given course that a student happens to be in. So if you are in school, know anybody who might be in school, typically college is where our sweet spot is, send them our way. Maybe we can help them save some money on their textbooks, or they may end up having to use our service for their class anyway. If you have any questions for me later on, there's my social media. If you go on that GitHub, you'll actually be able to find all of the code for this presentation. The presentation itself is an Angular app I wrote. There's also the other two presentations I did, which are also Angular apps. You can see that as I get to this third one, the code gets a little better, refactoring. You can look me up on Twitter, but there's not a lot of reason to. I think I've mentioned about my swimming a couple of times. So we are here to discuss testing. I think initially I stated unit testing, but I'm going to cover unit testing, integration testing, and also end-to-end testing. I specifically want to cover integration testing because as I was having a discussion with a very, very intelligent friend of mine, I was brought to the realization that I actually barely write unit tests. I tend to write integration tests. That's primarily because I'm kind of lazy. So reason we're discussing testing as an overall concept, the main reason most of you are here, is because manual testing sucks. We all know it, we all hate it, that's why it never gets done, and even if it does get done, it's crap when we do it because we never do it the same way and we never document it, we never do anything proper. And also because every organization loves testing. They think it is the greatest thing and every developer should be testing, and if you're not testing, you are not a good developer, and we don't even want to hire you. That is kind of a brief rundown of actually something I ran into when I was interviewing for a job. I did their programming assignment. The guy came back and said, "Oh, where's your testing?" It's like, you gave me a programming assignment that you said took 2 hours. It ended up taking me a day. Yeah, I'm not going to put testing into it. But back to the organizational level, it's great until they have to pay you to spend the massive amount of time it takes to actually write proper and good testing. Unit tests are their own little fun. Unit integration tests, I'm going to lump those together quite a bit. But then you have end-to-end testing, which any of you who've ever dealt with end-to-end testing or automated end-to-end testing, it's a whole different ball of wax. It's just a different way of thinking about things and dealing with it. Also, because maybe some of you have never had a chance to actually write any tests. Your organization doesn't let you, or you just haven't. Actually, can we get a show of hands about how many here have written Angular code but never written more than maybe a handful of tests total? All right, we got a few honest souls. I'm willing to say a couple of you with your hands down, you're probably lying to us, but that's fine. We're not here to judge much. And for that same reason, a handful of unit tests does not a testing suite make. You can write your your 2, 3, 4 tests, and they maybe hit a few pieces, and they're key pieces and they're valuable, but that's not really going to give you everything you need to do. You need to be able to test all of it. You need to test your controllers, you need to test your filters, you need to test your services, your directives, and providers if you have them. You can test constants, although I'm not sure how you're going to test it or what you're going to gain from it, but theoretically you could if you wanted to put the effort in. So let's go back to the idea of what can you actually do to test. You can do manual end-to-end testing, which is basically what any of us do when we maybe do a smoke test. You write your code, you bring up your app, you go, okay, I'm going to enter the username as Pete, and I'm going to say submit, and it works, I think. It looks like it works. As far as I know, I look in the dev console, no errors popped up. It's showing what I think it should be showing in the next screen. Great, done, move on. Oh, a couple days later, come back, rewrite some of that code. Now I added a last name to it. I come in, I go, oh, let me enter Pete Clody and hit submit. And okay, you know what? It looked good. Did I check the dev console? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe I just didn't care to, didn't think about it. and everything looked good, but I ended up having 4 errors in there that I just never noticed, and things kind of went kablooey somewhere, but I didn't notice it. That's one of the inherent problems we have with manual testing. It's very difficult to guarantee the consistency. I worked at an organization that actually had manual testers. It was a futures trading software company, and the people who were doing the testing were people who used to trade in the pit. So they knew exactly what they wanted to do. They could actually write down the minutia of, you do this, you do this, you do this, and this better happen. I'm just a software developer who never had any experience in the futures trading world until I got to that company. There's no way I can even write all of those steps, more or less actually do them myself. I was there for over 7 years, and maybe by the end of it, I had enough of a concept that I could probably write some semi-solid tests, but nowhere near as good as the guys who spent years trying to earn their living in those pits. So manual end-to-end testing, prone to errors, very problematic. Then you have unit testing. Unit testing is basically where you're going to focus on an individual piece of code. You're going to focus on a service. And within that service, you're going to focus on the individual functions, and you are going to treat each of those functions as the world. There is nothing outside of it, basically there is nothing that can be outside of it. If that particular method is going to call out to somewhere, you fake that. You have to go in and say, okay, here is a fake version of whatever it's going to call, and it's going to return something that I can guarantee is going to be this thing all the time, so that when it calls it, we can guarantee that it is not being any test is not being influenced by what's going on outside of it. That is a massive pain and a lot of work, and hence the laziness, hence the reason I do integration testing. Integration testing is where you're testing your entire code base. You're actually going to be testing the full path through your system. So you have one service that talks to another service that then, or maybe you have a controller that talks to a service that talks to another service, maybe does an API call, comes back, and then it comes back up the chain. Your integration test will actually allow the code you've already written for your real live production app to run through, and then you just have to mock up anything that's outside of your system. So you'd have to mock up that API call. So it saves a lot of effort, because you're not rewriting your code many times for these unit tests, or specifically for these unit tests, which also in and of itself can lead to errors. And that way you can kind of get a lot of code coverage very quickly, but you also have to be careful, because you get code coverage. Who knows if you're actually covering it as effectively as you want to. Then, as I mentioned already, automated end-to-end testing. That's where you actually use tools like Selenium with its WebDriver component, and then you use Protractor, which was written by the Angular team to give you some of the extra bits that make it easier to tap into what Angular gives you already to deal with it. End-to-end testing, as I said, is kind of weird when you're coming from a developer's background and you're writing a lot of unit tests, because the end-to-end testing, you have to think like a user. If it isn't visible on that screen, like right now, I have 4 little unordered list items. I have a header, and then I have some buttons. I can't access anything except that. I can say I want the list items, and then I want the third one. I want the header. I want to get that control, because I know it's a H2. I think I'm using, I don't know, H1, H2, or I want the button, and I want to be able to make sure that at this point, because I'm at the end of this slide, that the color is changed. That's all you can do. You can't get to the underlying code structure. So we'll definitely dive into this more, but that's just your high level. So, that makes it a little different, a little bit not what we're used to. So, it took me a little while when I first started writing some end-to-end tests to kind of get used to that. I had to change how I even structured my test setup. So as I said, manual end-to-end test, you launch your app in your browser. You do stuff, whatever that stuff may be. You make your app work. You write down any bugs you may find, and then you repeat every time you update your code. And of course, you have a frowny face, because it sucks. Well, so that's how the user deals with things. Manual testing, that's all user-based. How does a developer test? We got unit testing. As I mentioned, you test everything in isolation. You're going to actually test that function in your service. And obviously you make the call on it, but you should be, anything that goes outside of that, the curly braces for that function, you should be mocking up. It should all be fake stuff, and that's going to be things that you're going to deal with through your testing framework, either Jasmine or Mocha, and then also roll through with some of the mock functionality that Angular gives you through their Angular mock module. So as I said, you have to mock all the dependencies. A lot of work involved. Then you have integration testing. Just to reiterate, you're testing everything together that's within your code base. I'm testing service A. I have service A that calls service B that then uses filter Q and maybe makes an API call, or then makes an API call, then uses filter Q when it gets a return. I'm going to let that code all run through, and I will have to fake the API call because it can't go outside the system. But when it comes back, I'm still going to use the code I already wrote for filter Q, and that way you can test how things are actually working in the real world, all combined. Because there are situations where if you test something in isolation, you can make it work or you can make it fail in very specific cases. But what happens when things, maybe there's some massaging of the data in the service that causes that filter to blow up that you didn't think about when you're writing your unit test for that filter. This helps you find any of those weird little cases of where your business logic actually can cause you problems and not just that little chunk. Did you have a question? Or?
Yeah, so I guess for integration testing by design, it seems that it would be written in after you've written sort of maybe either your first iteration of code. Can you talk about, like, I guess how it might work within the TDD format?
Personally, I don't really buy into TDD that hardcore. The whole idea of writing your tests, knowing your logic, knowing your logic from a functional level and a requirements level, writing all your tests, then coming in and writing your code to match those tests. I kind of go with I still go with the old method of you write your code and then you write your tests, and while you're running your tests, maybe that you're finding that when you're running your test is getting weird. And you can go, oh, it smells bad. And you can go, okay, well, that means that there's something wrong in my code or something of that ilk. As far as integration tests, that starts to get more into BDD, where you're getting your behavioral-driven development, because it's actually gearing more so functionally what your application is trying to do, not at the very low code level. So it fits, but not fully. It's similar. Did you have a follow-up? Okay. Want to make sure I didn't cut you off. Then we have end-to-end testing, which I mentioned. You're testing like a user. You're going in. All you can do is click on buttons, enter data into input boxes, click on check boxes. Do anything that's you can do it. If you gave it to the theoretical, you gave it to your mom, and she could click on the app and do whatever. That's all an end-to-end test should be doing. I'm sure you could find ways to hack and get underneath it, but that's all it should be doing. And that leads to a different idea from your unit testing and your integration testing. Just how you're structuring it, because you're not writing a spec that is geared towards a given object. You're not writing a spec that's geared towards service X and function Y. You're writing it towards, I want to enter a new user and create a new user within the system, and then verify that their name is proper when it comes up in admin panel or something. Whatever that flow happens to be for your system, that's what you're testing. And so you have to think of your spec as that, and the actual function, the actual test itself starts to get kind of ugly because of that, because you actually see different pieces coming in, different pages, different interactions, and it seems to be, it tends to be a bit longer, at least in my experience. All right, so that's all the different things, but it's one thing to actually write these tests and then go in and say, okay, I want to run this test now, and then this test now, or this, test script, this spec now. We want to build it all together and just be able to say, run. So that's when we start automating it. That's why we use Grunt. That's why or Gulp. That's, we don't want to do all this stuff manually. It's too tedious, and no one none of our bosses would like us if we did. So there's Karma. It was written by, I have no idea how to pronounce his name. Vocha, I have no idea. Guy on the Angular team. He actually wrote that. I think he also wrote what is now Protractor, or at least had a big hand in it. Karma, the Karma test runner, actually the spectacular test runner. Yes, actually it used to be called Testacular. Apparently they changed it because it got squeamish. I don't know. You got to be bold. So this allows you to actually, this just sets up your configuration, much like a grunt file would set up your build configurations. This just allows you to set up the configuration, tell it, here's all the files I'm dealing with, here's everything that needs to come into play to do this, run. Then you have Jasmine. There's also Mocha is another option. Jasmine is the testing framework. It's the underlying framework that actually allows you, that actually handles defining the test. We'll see a couple tests definitions in a minute. Needless to say, that it allows you to say, okay, here's the block of code that is the test. Here's how I can bootstrap everything together, and then here's how I actually verify it. So if you've ever seen any testing in any other language where it's usually, is this assert if this value is false, or assert if this is, if it's meeting your condition or not meeting your condition. That's what it gives you. It has its functionality is expect. So it says expect, and then whatever your value is, and then it gives you a bunch of matchers, as they call them, after that, where you can say it's either, 2B, was it 2B, which is a triple equals, 2B equal, which is a double equal. Then they have a match, which is a regex, a contains for arrays. You can verify if something's truthy. You can verify if something's falsy. You can verify if it's defined or undefined. They have quite a few different things. Really, you'd have to, you dive in and you start finding what are the pieces that actually work for you, and you start to hit a few of them more so than others. They have a fancy thing that if you're really writing hardcore unit testing, where you can create spies, which allows you to then mock individual functions on objects. That's if you're writing a really hardcore unit test. Typically, is when you use that. I don't use them that much, as I said. I'm lazy. I do integration testing. Then we have Protractor, which works in concert with Karma and Jasmine to do, it gives you extra functionality geared specifically towards Angular, so that when you're hitting the DOM, because when you're hitting the DOM in these tests, you have to say, I want to find something based on the CSS. I want to find something based on an ID that it has, or I want to find it because of the particular tag that it is, or grouping of tags. Protractor gives you some extra functionality that will say, well, I know that, I want to find the input field that has the model first name, and it allows you to do that. It'll say it has a, by model, and then you just say first name, and it finds it. And it has a few other ones like that. You can do it by binding, which they've been improving that one over time. Text, like you can do it based on the text that's in a button, and a few different ideas like that. And it just makes it easier to it gives you extra functionality that's geared towards Angular, and just, makes the end-to-end testing a little bit more pleasant to write. Some other tools. We got Mocha, there's Sinon, no idea. And then Chai. There's actually some functionality within Angular mocks that only works with Jasmine and Mocha. So be aware of that. If you have ever used Sinon and Chai, and those are what you want to use, there's actually things that won't work in Angular mocks because of it. So you're kind of, in that way, forced away from it. Let's see what we got next. All right. This is basically just a quick configuration of Karma. Hopefully those in the back, it's big enough you can see it. I mean, you can find this all online, but the basic idea is that, you got to tell it where everything is through its base path. You're telling it what framework you want to use. Are you using Jasmine? Are you using Mocha? It's an array, so theoretically you could use both. I haven't tried it, but I'm sure you could. You tell it all the files that you need to load to actually be able to run this. Generally for Karma, or if you're just setting up unit testing, integration testing, this is pretty simple. More than likely, you're not going to need to pull in any of your Bower components, or if you're using NPM for your Angular app to pull in components. So this is just going to be your JavaScript your HTML, and then your actual test specs. You might think, oh, yes.
I was going to say, I mean, anything you have as a dependency, you can build it, right? I mean, any libraries that you have as dependencies in your applications.
It depends. If they're purely for UI type stuff, then no. Like we in our testing suite, we use Foundation, and for unit testing, I don't need Foundation because nothing that it's giving me is actually being used by my services, my controllers, and so on, because they're not actually pulling back to the template itself.
But
So
I mean, do you use any modules that you do in the app config, but you need to pull those in, and you need to pull them in order of which you have the dependencies, you know, so
yeah.
like, let's say they use ng-route, you know, for example, which is not part of Angular,
Yeah.
but you still have that in the brackets of your app config kind of deal.
Yeah.
You need to put that guy in the font, right?
I mean, well, that depends. And actually, that brings up a point. When you're dealing with the unit testing, and this is something I ran into when I was actually trying to write unit integration tests for my routing, I was running into a big hassle because you have, typically you'll have an app.js file, and you'll have your config block, and it has everything in there, and then you have your run block, and it has whatever you have in your run block. And I was like, and I couldn't figure out how do I do what I need to do and verify all this routing. I mean, outside of actually just saying, okay, location, go here, and then does it go there? Does it actually give me what I want? And I actually ran into some documentation in the Angular documentation that explicitly stated you should actually pull those out into separate files that are not going to be tested, and break those down so you have, because you can have multiple config blocks, multiple run blocks. So you break it down and you'll have a config block that handles just configuring the router. And I tend to always use just the default router. And then it just sits there, and if it's fairly simple, you don't have to worry about testing much. And that way you can pull it out of your code and it doesn't actually become a dependency for you.
If you're saying you stub or spy, kind of deal?
Well, not even stubbing or spying. The routing, even by pulling it out and ignoring it, the routing is still
You'll have a missing pair, so don't say.
Yeah, let me come back to that because I know I pulled them all out for testing purposes, but I'd have to check in my real code because this is all based on a test app I just wrote, and it's crap. I'm not going to lie to anybody. It is a thing I threw together. It is possible that in here I don't need it. I'm trying to think back to my real production app at work. I think do you remember that Karma config? Looking at my coworker who might remember better than I think we actually do pull in the Angular components in there. So actually, yeah, you are.
I think, I mean, I'm not correcting you or anything. I'm just saying, I think that's what you have to do. And
Yeah.
I know I ran into, you have different providers where you have certain dependencies that you ran, and if you ran in the same order in that array specification.
Yeah, typically, you're going to put all your Angular and everything else, all your third parties up at the top. But by and large, it also comes down to, is it a third party that's actually code-based, or is it a third party that is UI-based? And that's where you can start, getting away from certain things you don't need to include. But yeah, you are correct. I'm trying to remember, and I think you are extremely correct, and I'm speaking incorrectly here. All right, so
You call in the power.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I was incorrect on that. All right. Good call. You saved everybody a lot. You saved a lot of people a lot of problems. So.
I ran into it, so I thought maybe, save 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Or an hour like this.
Yeah. I can't remember how. I remember running into it. I can't remember how big of a hassle it ended up being. It was a while ago. So then we got we got some preprocessors that actually, if you notice, the first one, coverage. Everybody loves coverage. It's nice to know what you actually did. It helps you figure things out. This is a coverage plugin that's just, jump on the Karma page and it points you. And it's one of the things that either they wrote or somebody else wrote. And it's really nice little thing. The next one, the ng-html2JSS, or 2JS, not JSS. That actually becomes very important if you write your directives where you use template URL, which I do. And so you need that, because what this will do is it will take all your template files and pull them back into a template cache module that then gets injected and put into your app, which actually we do right down here, where we configure it and say the module name. And if you give it the same module name that your app is, it will build it up. It will load that JS file with the template cache, and that way you have access to all your templates. As I said, I run into that with my directives because I use template URL. If you put if instead of template URL and you just put the actual template string in there, you probably can get away with it. Have only filtered services, and yeah, they don't need that because they don't have any templates at all, so it doesn't cause them any problems. And then you tell it what the reporters are, which in this case is progress and coverage. Progress is just a built-in way that Karma and Jasmine are gonna let you know what's going on. And then most importantly, you tell it what browsers you want. This actually comes into play in a very interesting way that you can find the benefit of when you're writing end-to-end tests. So you have Phantom.js, which if you're not familiar and if you aren't running unit tests, maybe you probably never worried about. It is a headless WebKit browser. So what that means is some team took the WebKit system and they went out and built a browser that has no UI. That way you can just run it from a command line. It can be run from here, and it just gives you the WebKit browser engine. And so you can do whatever you need to do and hit it, and it'll work it mostly works like Chrome or Safari, but every now and again you hit an eccentricity. I've run into that with weird, I think it was URI decoding or something weird, like some weird little eccentricities you might run into here or there. So you got Phantom.js. You can also put in Chrome, Firefox. If you're on Mac, you can put in Safari. If you're on Windows, you can put in IE. But it depends on what you have available. It has to be something you actually have available because it needs to be able to run it. And then the single run just lets you say run through these tests, and then when it's done, and my process finishes. But you can also say single run false, which will then allow you to let it sit, and it will run through them, report whatever it reports, but also in conjunction with auto watch, when it sees any of those files update, it will rerun your test, which is kind of nice because that way you're not sitting there constantly typing grunt test as mine is configured, or whatever your command is. You just run it, let it sit, and as long as you don't do some really bad things and cause it to crash, great. And yes, you can do things that actually cause it to crash. I've done that a couple of times. And then if running it in grunt, which is really what we want to do. I mean, technically, yes, you can have that conf file, and you can just run you can set up Karma. It's an npm module. You can install it globally, run Karma, give it the conf file name, and because we told it the paths and all that, it'll run through all the tests. But then you're just running that all the time, and you don't have as it's just not as clean, and you can't. Then if you want to do it in your deployment system, you have to then write that command separately. You have to make sure that Karma is installed globally in whatever system that is, or you install it locally, and then you have to path it, and it's just more effort. Where you can just run it out of grunt or gulp. Same thing. They both have modules, and it's basically as simple as it can be. You tell it where your conf file is. And then I have two different ones where I say CI for continuous integration and another one for unit. So continuous integration will sit there and run and wait for any, finish whatever the run is, and then sit there and keep running, waiting for files to change and rerun the test. Or unit, which is what I use on my deployment system, which will just run through and say, okay, everything's great because there's no code going to change because it's a deployment system, and move on. All right. So now, actually, you know what? All right, come on. Oh, pretty. All right, here we go. This is not as bad as the other thing. So we don't need this. So now let's just see, I was mentioning, you can run it through grunt. Hopefully you can read this. It's down at the bottom. It's, if you need to stand, hopefully that Is the text big enough? All right. That look big? All right, we'll go a little bit higher. All right. So let's run grunt test. And it runs through, it builds up the whole system so it actually has the code. And then we just come down here, and this is what we really care about. This is where you're actually looking at the output, and it tells you, okay, it's Karma, and here's a version of it. It's running on that server. It started with PhantomJS, connected on a socket that who cares about. It ran against PhantomJS 1.98, which is great. And then it tells you it ran 16 out of 16 tests. All of them passed, and it took a big whopping, I don't really know what the first one is against the second one. It took almost nothing. And then it gives you a good output, and that's more grunty stuff than anything. So, that's really what happens. And if I wanted to do the same thing, I think it's test CI. So this is the same idea where it's continuous integration. Unfortunately, it's way down at the bottom, so it's harder to see. You'll see that it did the same thing, but now it's just sitting there. It's waiting for a file to change so then it can rerun. So that's all it is, and kill that. Yes?
For a standard, I hate to ask this question because I don't know if it sounds like really green, but how many tests, like, can you give me a sense of, like, what type of quantity will ensure, like, a pretty reliable test coverage, or what
240.
240?
Yeah, I mean, really, there is no number. It depends on the complexity of your code. It depends on, first off, how big your application really is. If you have an app that's 2 pages, has 2 controllers, 1 service, and makes an API call, could you possibly get by with a dozen tests, 2 dozen tests? It depends on what you feel is comfortable to handle whatever you're doing. And that's where the code coverage actually comes into play. It actually helps give you a more quantified version or quantified view of what you actually ran against and what you're testing. So I'll show that in just a second here.
Okay.
No, I was just going to say, like, would you feel more comfortable giving a percentage instead of like an actual?
Yeah, and that's where the code coverage comes into play because, as I said, I mean, I made up the number 240 because there is no, I mean, a number of tests doesn't mean anything. It's possible you could write 600 tests for an app that has 5 pages, so 5 controllers, 10 services, makes 8 API calls, and maybe that's not nearly enough, or maybe that is complete overkill because you were testing complete bupkis most of the time. Like, oh, make sure that this controller is named this. It's like, well, no one cares. That doesn't matter. So those kinds of things. So it depends on. It really comes down to the quality of the test more so than how many. My current front end system that we just kind of are finishing up, that all said and done has about 300 tests. It's, I don't know, 7, 8 real pages, maybe 10. A good handful of servers, a lot of API calls back and forth for user stuff, and we're doing book rental, so a lot of different API calls. But we're able to get a pretty good test coverage out of it. So the actual code is being taken care of. So to that end, let's show this now because this is awful, isn't it? Oh, wrong way. There we go. That's a little better. So this is that code coverage I was referencing. This is the basic code coverage that you can find in Karma. It's actually quite handy. It's really and surprisingly useful. And what's funny anecdote, first time I saw this, I'm like, oh, this is great. So I know that out of all my controllers, I have 89.74% test coverage. Well, that's great. Man, I really wish I knew which ones were, which ones I tested, which ones I didn't, where did that, 10.26 come from? And then I just happened to click on it one day. Took me, it's not long, probably a couple of days before I noticed that. And I go, oh, this is cool. Okay, great. I know that, users JS, I'm covered. I'm hitting all the statements, all the branches, all the functions, all the lines. But that user JS, that's the one that's kind of causing me problems. Oh, whatever. Oh, hey, look, I can click on there. This is the bee's knees. I can see all of this stuff. And I was blown away when I first ran into this. Firstly, because it gave me all my code. I mean, it showed me real world, like this is what I'm used to seeing. I'm not going to look and say, oh, here's a stat and it's going to make sense to me, or block 8, or some weird hash that they want to come up with. It's telling me, okay, I got user controller. Here's what my code actually really looks like. And we come down and I have this little, this is a controller as situation. So it's a controller-based function. So this is something that's external to the outside world. So this is something I'm going to test directly. And it'll come in and say, okay, well, you know what? You have this if block, but you're not testing the if statement. You're not testing the if condition. You're testing only else conditions. That's what that little I tells me. So it's never hitting in here, as you can also see by the red. It's always coming down into this else. And then even in this else, I have a asynchronous resource call. And this is only ever coming in and hitting my success handler. I'm never testing an error handling. So that, as you can see, that actually gives me a lot more and more useful information about where my test coverage is and where it needs to be than just saying I have X number. Because I don't have a ton of tests written for this code. I mean, it's not a lot of code, as you can see. But I think I have 16 tests, and I'm getting fairly significant coverage. So this type of thing, and then it'll give you some more interesting things of it'll give you some other blocks and help show what's going on here and there. Yes.
So is there documentation that kind of tells like, okay, I means this, the red means that, and the orange means?
I don't know. I never looked for it. I just kind of really, honestly, with this code coverage tool, it was a lot of stumbling. And, you just start clicking on stuff, you're not going to hurt anything. So you can, when you see the code because it just puts the directory right wherever you're running your code from, you'll see it's just an index.html, it has some JavaScript, and then it just, it makes an HTML file for every single JS module. And so, yeah, it was merely, I was trying to figure that out, and then I happened to put my mouse over it and got the thing, and that told me. So there probably is documentation on it. I haven't, really dove into that just because I was able to figure it out on my own. At least I figured out enough of it to be happy. All right. We'll go back to all files. Go back to here. All right. So a quick break, even though this isn't a break, this is actually where we get into some of the more complex parts of testing, where we're actually dealing with Angular.mock. If any of you have ever used Yeoman or pretty much anything of that ilk to build up a quick Angular app, it's going to build some testing, and then you're going to have all these things in your Bower JSON file that are all part of your dependencies, and then you have this dev dependency that's Angular mock, and you're like, what the hell is Angular mock? And what it does is it provides you the methodology to pull stuff in that is normally in your real world app and pull it in so that it's available for the testing suite. It handles doing the module registration. It also provides a access for your dependency injector service. And it provides a lot of other things, but then there's also the more prominent ones are the HTTP backend service, which is the one that's one of the big three that you're going to use quite a bit. So first we'll deal with module. So basically what this does is it allows you to register your module. And it's not quite a similar way to what you're used to when you're doing Angular.module, and then you give it, and then you say here's a name, and then you give it an array of dependencies. That's all handled. That it's able to get all of that information from your real code what you're doing here is you're just saying, you know what, this is something that I need you to register into the test app system. It gives you an injector, which then also gives you access to any of the services, filters, anything that you're going to pull into your test code later on. And as I mentioned way back at the beginning, it's only available under Jasmine and Mocha. They claim they actually have code in their system that will not load it unless it's Jasmine or Mocha. So if you're one of those people who likes Chai or Sign-On, oops, apparently Angular does not care. Then we have inject. Inject is an interesting function because really what it's doing is you use this to wrap a block of code to generate an injector for that block of code. And so, basically it creates a new injector service instance. It can be used anywhere. If you've ever seen any test code, you'll see that they have things like before each, describe, and it blocks are the three, and then there's also an after each, three major sections. It can be used within those declarations. It can be used actually within the body of an it block if you want to. Once again, only available under Jasmine and Mocha. And if you, here, let me zoom it because it's a little weird. This is actually a valid thing, which is kind of weird. You do an inject on a before each, so that generates a new injector. You actually then take your injector into that function, and then you actually use the injector itself directly to get the service you want. I picked Q because it's actually a really small little thing that only takes up 2 characters, and I didn't have a ton of room. That's kind of one way to do it. It's a little bit clunky. They actually have a cleaner way of doing it. Let's see. We'll get to that, but get to that in a second. Then we have HTTP backend service, which is really, I found this to be the one I use a ton, and it actually causes me the greatest pain because it's just a lot of code you have to write, and it's tedious at times. So what this does is, so we're all familiar, or most are probably familiar, or will become familiar with the HTTP service itself. And that's what it's allowing you to do any of your AJAX calls and pretty much any kind of call you're going to make outside using HTTP. So that makes a call out. Well, when you're writing unit tests and integration tests, you don't want to go outside of your code base. So you need some way to stop it and tell it what's going on. So what HTTP backend does is any request coming out of HTTP that's being made by HTTP, which you remember, even if you're doing a resource, that's just a wrapper for an HTTP. You then define what that request looks like and how you want to respond to it. And that's where the tediousness can come in. You can say, there's 2 different ways to do it. You can just say when, which, and then you tell it what the verb is, and then you can do an expect and tell it what the verb is, or it has wrappers for a when get, when post, when put, when delete, expect to get, expect to post, and so on. When and expect are 2 interesting little concepts. I've never dealt with expect just because the documentation, whenever I read it, always states that you use expect when you actually have a specific order of calls. So, and the call is only going to be made this one time. You're going to make this definition. It's going to be called once, and it's going to be called at a very precise time in relation to other calls. My code doesn't really need to care about that. I want to be able to, I'm more concerned about, I have a call. It's going to, if it looks like this, I want it to return this, because typically I want to get a user, and I want to get the same user over and over for different tests, because you know what, I just want it to be that user. I don't care about, there's no eccentricities to it. So, there is a difference there. I really recommend that when you get to the point of using that, read it. Maybe if you can find a couple resources that may help you more, go for them. Make sure that it works best for you. My understanding of it, when, has always been the best idea for me. So as we look at when, so as I said, it will handle any number of requests that match that definition exactly. And when I mean exactly, I mean exactly. It's like you can say, API call, it's a GET call for users, and then you give it a hash, and then you return back a value based on the hash of 1, 2, 3. If you are making an API call, if you're making a call somewhere in your code and that test, and it's calling user 1, 2, 4, it's not going to hit that, and it's going to throw an error saying, I don't know what this call is, I can't do anything, and then your test fails. Actually, if the test, quote unquote, doesn't fail, but the running of the test fail because here's something that just doesn't exist and it doesn't know about. So it does have to match exactly, and this can get tedious when you get into posts and puts where you're passing in big chunks of data that are, generic, or that are, just big and cumbersome, and it gets kind of nasty. It's not worried about ordering. Define it where you define it. Use it as much as you want. Define them in any order you want, and they're fine. It does have to have a response. So it actually, you make this call, user 1, 2, 3, and then you respond. Then you have a response function that comes off of that chains off of it, that will actually tell you, here's what the HTTP response looks like. So you give it an array that has, your status code, then your block of data, and then I think additional headers if you want to. We'll see that a little bit later on. But yeah, so that way you can say for user 1, 2, 3, here's what I want to send back. If it's user 1, 2, 4, I want to send back this. The expect call, very similar in many respects, but it only, the major differences are, according to the documentation, as I said, I've never actually dealt with an expect, so I haven't figured out a time that I've needed to, that it will only handle one call made to it. So you're going to have to define these in more discrete areas and recognize the fact that once you define it and it's going to get called, you have, if that call is going to be made again and looking the exact same way, you have to redefine it, which is kind of annoying, and depending on what data you're sending back, can get really hairy and ugly looking. It has a precise ordering, but it does not need a response. You can set it up and say, oh, I have, at this point, I'm going to get a call that's going to look like user 1, 2, 5, and then I'll get a call that's going to be user 1, 2, 8, and I don't really, 1, 2, 5, I wanted to say this because that's getting called first, but 1, 2, 8, fine, whatever, let that just be generic. It will then, HTTP backend will then look for any when declarations and use those if they exist to give it a response. So you gain a little bit of that. That's a little bit of an advantage, but as I said, a lot of code, you end up writing a lot of this code, and it becomes very tedious because you just end up putting a bunch of JSON data into your test scripts. So here is some actual code, which I'm guessing you can't see in the back based on how things are. So we'll just zoom. It'll be fine. So here we just see a quick definition of a filter. Nothing special. It comes in with this object called user. It's expecting to have a first name field and a last name field. If it's missing the first name, it replaces it with John. If it misses the last name, it replaces it with Doe. But so you could have any combination. So this is going to get a little bit nastier because I'm running out of horizontal space, and we'll go with it. And so here's what your test is actually going to look like. So this is our first time actually seeing some Jasmine test code. Basically, you start off with, you have a describe block, and this is how they declare describe blocks as test suites. So that way you can break them apart, and they actually form logical units, kind of with their own closures, so that within a given describe block, like this describe block can handle whatever is written above it. But if there's if there's a separate describe block down here, it doesn't know. So anything out, it can, just like standard closure, it can figure that out and find it, but it can't find anything that's maybe in a separate block below it, or even above it, but if it's in a separate block. So first we're gonna, and before each, we're gonna pull in our module. If you remember, this is coming out of Angular mock, and all you have to do is just give it the name. Because we've already loaded our normal production code into, through Karma into the system, it's able to go up and find that and say, oh, okay, you've already defined that it's using this module, this module, this module, this module. And that's actually where your point comes in, that if you're declaring those modules there, then you need to have those as part of your Karma config so that it can actually find them. But it's actually kind of, it's a nice clean way. Generally, the only time you ever do anything more than that in that before block is if you actually have to initialize providers. It's kind of nasty code. I didn't write any because I also couldn't figure out a good example of a provider to write. But usually that it depends on when you have to deal with providers, when that actually comes into play. You shouldn't have any trouble finding documentation. It's usually I think it's just an extra param. You just pass in a function. And then here we're actually doing our injection. So now you'll see this time, instead of inject and then an injector service, you actually use this weird syntax of underscore filter. Underscore filter underscore. What that does, the mock injector is able to recognize that and strip those underscores, and it has to be one at the front, one at the back. It can strip it and then do the actual normal dependency injection and find that service or provider or filter or whatever that happens to be for you. And then, then we take it and we make a local copy, or we grab a local copy to that reference so that we can use it later on outside of this. So this is just a clean way of getting this injection done. Quick note: you can get away without putting the underscores on there, and it'll still work, but then that code would fail. So the main reason they do this, and it's kind of a standard I've seen in any documentation I've come across, it's basically because you're going to be making this local copy of it, you put in the underscores, and that way you can just save it off and use it later on in your test suite. If you go back to my previous example where you actually injected the injector, you can then use the injector's get function to do the same thing. In that case, you don't need the underscores, but it's the code's a little nastier. It just takes a little longer. So but it's all personal preference. You can do either one. I don't know either one being better or worse than the other. But let's go back to this before each. I kind of glossed over that. Before each means exactly what you think it means. It means before every test, before each test, we're going to run this, or actually before each block. So, this is going to say, because it's at this high level, before anything here runs. So, this one, so right now this is going to run. It's going to do the inject. We're going to get that local filter, local reference to the filter service. We're going to run this test. Before we hit this describe block and do these, we're rerunning this. So it's creating a new injector. It's re-getting that service, and that way it's reinitializing it. And so the purpose behind it is you help guarantee clean code. You're not worried about something vestigial being in there that's going to cause you a problem that, maybe you forgot to clear a reference that you set, or some kind of variable you set. Maybe you set a true somewhere to change something and you didn't remember to clear it. This guarantees that you don't have to worry about that. And so you can put anything you want in that function block, not just injecting filters or services and other of that ilk. You can put in custom code if you want. It all depends on what is necessary for your code. It's whatever you need to do to clean up and be sure that you're ready to test this suite. So then we come into an it block. An it block is, yes?
Sorry, you might just go in one other thing is that before each of the inject, things that are native within the Angular application, like filters, controllers, things like that, you have that syntax of underscore, dollar, whatever.
Yeah.
But things that are locally created for the instance, for example, when you're testing controllers and using scope, you generally won't use that syntax, right? You'll actually do a root scope create of a new scope.
Yes, that is correct.
And that kind of pattern will be the same for anything that's locally generated in the instance versus anything that's native within Angular. So native is underscore, dollar, whatever. Locally is, it's up to you to actually define those things and recreate or initialize your mock.
I will say it depends on how you're utilizing your particular, if it's your own service, typically, it depends on if you're actually creating a service that is instance-based or class-based, or not quite class-based.
Service factors, but I mean, like for example, scope. like.
Oh yeah, scope you definitely have to create, manually create.
Scope dot
Yeah.
Whatever it is, new scope, whatever it is.
Yes.
S dot scope. Just a little thing that, I thought was always a little odd to see. All of a sudden you're doing this, but then you stop doing it for certain pieces.
Yeah. And actually, there is an example that will come up that will help read. Oh no, that's fine. It's great to bring up, and it will help reiterate it later. Yeah, scope is definitely one of those weird ones, which is also why they're kind of getting rid of it. It has its own rules that are kind of make it difficult to reconcile with everything else. Same reason why a lot of people have problems with directives. There's just different rules that come into play. But yeah, very correct. So if we get into this it block, and this is where we're actually going to do your actual test. You're actually going to do it within your it block. And here is the very same thing. You give it a quick name. This is just a pattern that I started using, and then you have your function. You could actually wrap that function in an inject if you so chose, and then do all the injection you want. So you could actually inject locally to here if you really wanted to, if you had something that was specific to this block that you didn't care anybody else to have. And here I'm creating a quick JSON object, and then I'm just running my filter within this expect function. So that's going to basically process what's going on. And then it has this matcher saying, okay, if I pass in this user, which has a first name Pete, and trust me, it has a last name Clody, that you run this filter on it, that the resulting response is going to be Pete Clody. And so that will run and that will pass. That's the expectation I have. And if the filter is working properly, that's what it's going to do. And here we have some, then down here we hit failure cases. So, to go back to your question of how many tests do you need, basically test what makes sense to test. So here we're testing a success. And then for failure cases, I have two different ways it can fail. I can fail because it doesn't have a first name. I can fail because it doesn't have a last name. And even then, failure is, define it how you will. So, that way I can verify, okay, John Clody or Pete Doe, making sure that when I do things that I know are contradictory to how it's defined or going to do a particular functionality, that it matches that up. Here we'll show a directive. This is a very simple directive that actually doesn't have much going on. It does some transclusion. That's all it does. It doesn't actually have any code in it. But one thing it does have is it has an isolated scope. For any of you who know enough about directives or dealt with them, the isolated scope, it's kind of its own special little deal. That way it's going to be something that's completely independent and unique to each instance of your directive. You could also have scope true, where it's going to then be all the scopes on that page, I believe it is, are going to reuse that same scope. But in this case, we're dealing with an isolated, and the isolated actually comes into play in a very interesting way. We'll see in a minute. So actually, to go back to your point, we'll just come down to this before each right now. We inject. I'm actually, just for consistency's sake, I put the double underscores around root scope. You don't need to. Because I'm not actually planning on storing root scope anywhere, I don't need to. But what I have to do is first I have a compile, which I need to be able to do because I have to compile up my directive. But as he said, you take your root scope and then you're actually calling $new. So you're actually generating a brand new child scope off of the root scope, because that's what Angular itself really does. So you have to you're mocking that idea with this test code. And so then I'm doing an extend so that I can add a brand name value to that child scope I created. So that's getting all set up. And then when I actually run the test, I have to compile that directive. So this is just a little function. I'm passing in a scope, and I'm also passing in the code that I'm going to transclude into my directive. And so when we actually come up into compile directive, it comes in and it actually runs the compile service with, my directive is called header. I have the brand name attribute. I'm then binding brand name. And then I'm closing it off, and I'm putting in my transcluded HTML, closing that off. So I'm actually building the HTML as it would look in your normal template where you use this directive. And that's going into compile. And I'm actually also, compile takes that as the first parameter, but then it's returning a function that then you pass in the scope object. So that's passing, so that way it knows here's the scope that, matches up to whatever's going on over here. I found that you always have to call apply just to force a digest cycle. I'm not sure why it really needs that, but if anybody actually can give a good explanation for it, appreciate that. And then I'm returning the element so that down here I have the element. And now when I actually want to recognize, what I'm trying to do here is verify is what's here in this brand name, which is part of this isolated scope. I want to verify that it's what I think it is, which should be Pete Clody's demo app. So you say, you get your element, you actually have to say dot isolated scope. You just can't say dot scope like you could in a controller or whatever. You actually have to tell it it's an isolate scope because it treats it differently. And then from there, you can pull off the parameter from that isolate scope and verify it. And then down here, it's the same deal, but I'm testing the transclusion. And what I'm doing is I'm actually verifying what the HTML looks like so that I can then say to match that it's actually going to match, and the match is a regex. So it just says, okay, is that in there somewhere? Which you also have to be careful of, because if you inadvertently have slashes in there, that it maybe sometimes thinks it's a different kind of regex and throws some things off. So sometimes that will bite you in the ass. But try to be careful of that when you can. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
A two-handed question.
Oh, sorry.
Big time.
Yeah, big time. The scope apply or digest, you only need to do that when you're doing anything with scope. It's like when you're doing controller apps, you didn't have to do anything. Okay. It just has to do with like digest cycles or whatever. Okay. Found that out earlier today, actually.
Yeah, that seemed to be where I was running into it. It's just, I never quite had enough of more so than, oh, this worked, so that must be what's going on. And you need to force a digest cycle. All right, so we're down on that guy. Here we're getting into some crazier stuff. Just standard, this actually, when you look at it compared to the directive, it's not super different. This is a controller. So, we have a very simple, this is just one function out of controller. My methodology is that you're going to test whatever you put on on the scope of your controller, that's what you're actually testing. So I have a function called edit user that allows me to pass in a user, and it just sends it, and basically it just uses that to generate the actual user editing page, which realize I never showed you the app. So let's look at this really, really high-end app. This is the app that's going to make me millions of dollars. So all this is just a listing of me, my wife, and my parents, and we're all awesome. That's pretty much what you can take away from that. It allows you to, you can check them and delete them if you wanted. You can, check them all, whatever, or you can edit them individually. You can also add users independently if you wanted. And editing apparently doesn't work. Oh, no. What happened is my Node app is crap. It's a little quick. All right, come on. It is really, all right, there we go. It just kind of likes to crash. It's a quick little Node Express app I wrote hitting a MongoDB. I don't know what's wrong. I'm not a Node developer. I just know that it wants to crash all of a sudden. Yeah. Microservices. Yes. Coworker over there, big Laravel fan, recently presented at Laracon. She's all about the microservices and PHP and such, and I write JavaScript, so I do Node. All right, let's get back to the presentation. So if we F5 this guy, I am not going to go back in and try to edit because I don't want to crash it again. But needless to say, that's pretty much what's going on. So that's your edit, which apparently causes a crash when you try to access that data. But then when you're when you have to test it, this it's all synchronous data, so it's not too crazy. You're not you're making a call that's just doing something, it's returning back, and everything's good. So all we're doing is, we're setting up, we're pulling everything in. I started putting all my routing paths into a constant that I then put onto the root scope, so that way whenever I'm in a template, I can easily access it. It just makes things a lot easier and cleaner for me in my code base. If you want to use a pattern, it's kind of there. You can kind of glean from it. Go ahead. If not, if you think it's the worst thing in the world, keep it to yourself. So we have our it. So what we're doing is we're just going to come in and we're going to initialize our location service because we need to have a base state. So I initialize it saying it's on the user's page because, well, it would be. Why not? Then I create my controller, which is up here, and all that's doing is just a simple controller service construction, passing in a scope. And then I'm calling on that scope, I'm calling edit user, and I have this users collection that I just created in a different file, which, by the way, quick tip, if you call something global.spec.js, it tends to just pull everything in and give you a lot of, you can like put some global objects out there. I haven't tested it fully to verify if it really starts to fall down if you have something that's named like basic.spec.js. I don't know how much the naming convention falls into play, but so far it's been working for me great. So hopefully it works for you, and it's a nice way to clean things up. And then, so I'm saying edit user, which is, we remember edit user is going to go off and just change the route. It's going to reroute to the user page and put that ID on it. So then all I'm going to do is just going to check that URL. So the location service has been updated now by that function. So I can validate it and say, does it match that? And then I'm just reconstructing it. I don't know. Yeah. So basically, I'm just kind of reconstructing and verifying that that's actually happening. So not the most exciting code you're going to see. Synchronous controller code is kind of boring. Asynchronous controller code, on the other hand, that's where you start getting fun. Anytime you get the asynchronous code, it starts to get fun. So what we're doing here is we're actually going to say retrieve users. I have a resource-based service called users, so that I can actually sit there in this function. It's just going to say scope.users and make a query on it. It's going to give me all the users, put it back into the HTTP promise, and that way I can, it'll just populate when it populates, and everything's happy. And so in the construction of my controller, I have that defined, and then I just call retrieve users. I don't do anything special because it's a test app, and I'm not actually worried about data validation and integrity. Also, I have a server that crashes whenever it wants to. So this create controller looks exactly the same, but now you'll notice that when we're injecting HTTP backend because we're making an external call. And so that's where it starts to get fun. So one thing you're going to do is whenever you start doing HTTP backend, you have to make sure you clean it up after your tests. So we're going, it's just going to fall over today. Oh, God. It's getting worse. Oh, God. All right.
I hope not.
Yeah. So what you'll do after each test runs, you have to make sure that you go by and you're verifying and cleaning up everything that's happened, making sure that every call that should have been made got made, and there's nothing sitting out there. Specifically, what that means is, I make, so my code makes that resource call, and that request is sitting out there in the mock system. If you notice down here at the very bottom, well, not as much at the bottom anymore, I have a flush call. That's what actually tells it, take all of those things that have been queued up, run them. And if you don't do that flush, and then you come back to this after each, that's when it blows up and gives you errors in your test. It's kind of a tedious thing, but it's something that kind of just needs to be done. Right now, I just kind of generically always put the expectation and the request. Since I don't do expects, I probably could get rid of it, but I'm not going to go through my entire code base, my whole testing code base, and change that. It's just not worth my time. But what you're doing here is I have to actually define this users function. So this is the actual call that it looks like. So if you went into your dev tools and looked at the network tab, you would see that it's saying HTTP 0000 port 4000 /users. It's a pretty simple get call. And then I'm telling it, this is how I want to respond to that get call. Function, oh, it's scrolled over. There we go. I'm just returning a 200 status. I'm returning that block of users that's coming out of the global.spec.js. And then that is additional headers, if I remember correctly. I've never run into a case where I needed to set those. Yes?
I'm still unclear on what the users variable is.
It's a global array I created in a different file. It basically it just saves me from having to actually manually put the JSON in there. Here, just wants to react eventually. Come on. I have no idea why this thing is screwed up. Anyway, there we go. So apparently I had to let go. Okay. This is going to take way longer than it needed to, but I want to make sure that you're comfortable with what's going on. All right. So this is all it is. It's just an array of JSON objects I'm creating. I just have them set up globally, so that way, you can imagine if I was retyping that or copy pasting that into every test spec. First off, the files would get horrendous, and secondly, there's always room for something getting screwed up. So it's just just a way to make things a little bit easier.
So that's like your fixture data, and does that live in the repository in your code base?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just made up test data. So obviously it's not something that you never want to put anything that you have concerns about.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully we are not running late. And so so we have that HTTP backend code or call set up. So then when create controller comes in, where it ends up initializing this, it ends up calling retrieve users, which is calling that query call, which then makes that backend HTTP call. So it all happens under the scenes, but we still have to define it. So then we can come in and we have this users object on scope, which is an HTTP promise object. So we pull out the promise, and then we can actually check. We have to wait until that data comes back before we can validate if it's good or not. If we just try to synchronously just say, okay, expect scope users length to equal, the length of this global object, it would more than likely fail because that response hasn't come back because it can't run until we call the flush, and also, the timing allows it. So this would happen before that happens. So we have to, much like any asynchronous call, we have to wait until that promise gets a response, and we're checking the success handler and say, okay, when the success comes back, verify that it actually gives me what I expect it to do, which is that user's block. And as I said, the HTTP backend flush, that's what actually triggers all of these queued up calls to happen. And that's where the expect to come in, that you have to make sure you're calling these in the proper order and defining them and so on. All right, controller as, it's a little bit different. Basically what it ends up being, where before you would actually do a create controller, you'd pass in the scope, and you then access, you'd say, scope dot whatever the function is, scope dot whatever the thing is. Now things are on the controller itself, which is actually embedded into a scope. And so it just changes it up a little bit. We have our simple define here, basically just doing a user's get call on an individual. So, another simple resource function. We're creating this controller, but you notice we're not passing in a scope anymore. We're just passing in some route params that are going to contain the ID of that user. And then down here, we're configuring the ID so it knows what it's actually going to be getting. And then we're going to be making the promise. And then when we're actually doing the expect calls, we stored the controller from the create controller call. Before, we just kind of let that fall on the floor, and we were only worried about scope. So now we actually need that controller, because that's how we're going to access anything that's been attached to it, since it's controller as. So this is update, and the user object, those have been attached. Those are actually attached on the this function, and actually is update. I don't think is actually, well, that's not. That's something different. That's actually UI stuff. But needless to say, the controller.user.id, that's how you access it when you're doing a controller as opposed to saying scope.user, it's now controller.user, and controller being what you've gotten back from your controller service call. That makes sense? Simple enough? All right. Service synchronous call. You know what? This kind of falls into the same realm of a controller. The difference is you don't actually have to create the controller. Depends on if you're using a class-based calls on a controller, or if you're using an instance-based. That's where maybe you actually have to create the instance of your service. In this case, we're just using a class-based calls. So we just have this function get users marked for deletion. It just scrolls through this array and returns the filtered out ones that are actually selected. So it's very simple. Much like anything else, you inject what you need to inject, which is that custom service. We don't have to create it. It's just instance-based calling. So we just store that. I'm just making a copy of users because I'm going to modify the data later, and I don't want to screw up my global. So here I'm just going through and saying, okay, every even numbered, everything with an even numbered index, so 0, 2, 4, what have you, make those selected. And then I come down here and I say, okay, off of this service, get users marked for deletion, and I'm passing in local users. I get back the response or the result, and then I can just immediately do all my expect calls on there because it's synchronous code. It doesn't have to go out anywhere. Everything just runs in the chain. You don't have to worry about anything getting in the way or anything happening out of order. An asynchronous call, this actually gets into an interesting thing. And even with this is actually more indicative of what you might run into in some of your controllers, where you're maybe making an asynchronous call, but that's not the only thing. That's not really what you want to respond on. You don't want the user reacting to that asynchronous call. You want them reacting to your interpretation of the asynchronous call. In this particular example, because the way the delete users is set up, I have this array of users that I want to delete. I think it's just, I don't know if it's users or just the ID. I can't remember. I guess it's the entire user. I'm passing in that array. I'm going through each one of those, and for every single one of those, I'm recognizing, okay, I could have 3 of these, but I'm making each call has to go out independently. So I'm making 3 separate calls. I don't want the user, if I could return user.delete, the problem is it would return out the very first one, and then how do you deal with the other ones? So I need to work out my own batching so that I can make this call all 3 times, but I also want to know when am I getting that third one back. You could do a simple, depending on what you're worried about, you can do a simple count where you just say, okay, I sent in 3, and then you get when you get the first one back, you decrement it, then you decrement it, then you decrement it, and when it finally hits 0, you say, okay, everything's happy, and send it out the door. I went a little bit crazier. I have this whole deleted user thing where it's basically doing the same thing. It's probably just a little more complex than it needs to be. But it also has a function that allows you to say, is it fully completed? And when it is, that, and this is, for anyone who's familiar with the queue service that Angular has, that's all I'm using, where you have this deferred object and you're resolving it. If everything came back, in this case, this is poorly written code. So if the very last one that comes back is successful, then it says everything's successful. If the last one that comes back is an error, then it says everything's rejected. It's just bad code. I wouldn't use it as gospel. It's just a test app. But it will basically return that. So that way I have control over when the user gets notified that this asynchronous call is done. So instead, even though it's 3 asynchronous calls, I'm telling the user of this function treats it as only ever recognizing it as 1. And then here, we created the deferred object, we're using it in there, and then we just return the promise out of it so that it can be used later. Yes?
If you have a few other calls going on, we can use the queue.board. You can use the queue.board.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's better ways to write it. This was honest to goodness, I was getting pretty tired by the time I was writing this part of it. So I will grant this code is atrocious. Don't use it as a basis, but take the general idea of it away. And so here we have this get. We're getting the users. We have we're getting the query, so we can get all the users. And then once we get it, but we get all these users, we're then saying, okay, for each, we're setting that same every other one. We take those, and then we're calling the delete. And for and then selected users for each. We're actually, because I have to go through and find all the ones that we're setting this index on, I have to configure a delete handler on the HTTP backend for each one of those, IDs. So I have to say user/1, user/3, user/4. So I have all that. So it's all this setup, as you can see. I mean, this is greatly compressed, but this is this is a considerable amount of setup. And even then, I'm kind of wrapping it into, this is actually the success handler for the query, for the users.query function. So I kind of have an asynchronous call that I'm embedding myself into to then make other asynchronous calls that I can test. Maybe not the most typical use case, but things like this can happen and it can get kind of gnarly. But much like we did when we had an asynchronous call in the controller, so we make this call, to delete users. We send in what we want to send in. We then have a then function. And in that then function, we can handle a success. We can handle an error. And then, and this one, as you can see, true to be truthy. It is what it is. HTTP backend flush, this will actually trigger all of those queued up calls to happen. And then this guy will return success. Then all that will happen. Then that guy will return success. And it'll just move through, and you can see here's where you would actually handle whatever you want to handle. Hopefully, you'll have better code. The problem is my code doesn't actually return anything out of that delete function, so there's nothing to verify. So that's why I have true to be truthy. But the concept is there. You have to you can't do your expect until that asynchronous call actually is finished. All right. That was a lot, wasn't it? That's unit testing, integration testing. It is a lot of fun. We can go back. Here we can. Let's see. I don't know why it keeps pulling up all that other stuff. Okay. I don't know what the heck it did there. We'll ignore that one. So we saw all those different tests. Now you can see that if you can run. Okay, I did not have focus. Where'd my mouse go? Oh, wow, I got a parse error. Nice. Okay, so I must have screwed up global spec at some point when I brought it up. So my tests are failing because of that. But as you can see, unfortunately, the actual running of a test is not the most user-friendly thing to show to a group. It's not going to impress anybody, but you can definitely see that if you get an error, it'll generate out. It's like, okay, here we have an actual problem in the global spec. It parses it out and says, oh, syntax. So in a way that actually can help you out, because then it can find you can use it as a kind of de facto syntax checker, which is something that doesn't terribly pop up very often in the world of JavaScript. But that's about all you get out of your test. It's usually get a big listing and it says, okay, this is great, this is great, this is great. Here's where you failed. So let's go back. And now we're going to talk about E2E testing again. We pretty much handled unit testing. I mean, there's a lot of different things that go into it. Depending on how complex your code is, will also determine how complex your testing gets and how nasty some of your actual individual tests are. But if we talk back about end-to-end testing, we go through the different things. We got manually launching your app, performing your tests, noting bugs, fixing bugs, hoping you tested the system properly, which you probably didn't because you're a person and you're going to screw up and you're going to miss something that you did 4 weeks ago that you forgot to do this time. Or you came up with a new idea that you hadn't been doing for 3 months and now you do it now and you go, oh, crap, everything blew up. and then you return to step 1. And it's painful, it takes a long time, and it's prone to errors. Whereas with your automated testing, you set up your test environment. So generally when you're doing automated testing, automated end-to-end testing, because you're acting like a user and you're writing data to databases, you're doing things to different backend systems, you want to, as much as possible, you want to be able to pull special dedicated servers out specifically for these tests so that you have complete control. Because the last thing you want is, oh, I'm trying to add this user and then I want to check a user count or do something of that nature or pull from a user list. You don't want to have to worry about everybody else on your dev team pumping data into there underneath you and causing this list to be, any kind of number. You want to have complete control. So, usually setting up a test environment is going to save you a lot of pain down the road. Configuring your test runner, which is just, Karma, Jasmine, and for Angular, you're going to be wanting to use Protractor. You're going to write your tests. Your tests are going to be fun. They're going to be different than unit tests in some degree, and we'll show an example and kind of get a bead on what's going on. You run your now codified tests, or codified, I guess is actually how you pronounce it. What that means is these are tests that have been written down, and they are there. It's not, there is no interpretation for a person to ever make. If you have a manual test, even if you write a manual test script, a user may be going down and Jim is all of a sudden tired at the end of Thursday, and he inadvertently skips step 5 out of and moves from 4 to 6. The software is not going to do that, so that helps you out. Now you're going to note any bugs, create the bug reports. You're going to fix those bugs because you want to make clean code and you take pride in that. You also can know that you tested the system fully because you have actually written down what exactly is happening, and you know that what you wrote down is actually happening, hence automated and codified. Then you return to step 4, where you run your codified tests. Maybe you have to write some new tests here and there, depends on what's going on in your system, but that's generally what we're dealing with. All right, as I've been stating a lot, they're written differently than unit and integration tests. This focuses on use cases, not object methodologies. So an object methodology, as we saw, is edit the user. So here's a user, make sure that it goes to this new page. You're not really doing anything beyond. You're not really editing the user. What you're doing is you're verifying that it goes to the correct page. If you want it to go to the user page for Pete, it goes there. That's what you're verifying. But even then, you're only verifying it at the code level. Who knows what a browser could do on top of you? So this actually says, I want to find user. I want to pull up a list, verify that I have a user Pete. Then I want to edit him, and I want to change him from user Pete to user Joe. It actually goes through, and you'll do all those steps and verify that that actually happens, and you'll be doing submits, and you'll be hitting databases, and it'll be very, very complete. So as I said, you're writing code to encapsulate page components and functionality. You're trying to encapsulate what the app does, not what your code does. It's a very important distinction, but sometimes it doesn't quite click. There's certain days where you're like, well, no, the app is the code and the code is the app. It's like, no, there is specific differences between those. And that is, the part that you have to start getting your mind wrapped around when you're writing end-to-end tests. Is that it? All right. Configuring Protractor. We'll just, we'll not spend a ton of time on this. Some of the important things to notice. You got to set up a base URL because you have to tell it where your browser, what is going to be the base for your browser to go to. Anything you do after this, whenever you say go to page blah, it's going to be using that as your base. So it could be a domain like I have. It could be a domain with maybe a couple things chained off the end, but everything's going to be based off of that as far as Karma and Protractor are concerned. Direct Connect, this is all just configurations to actually hook the Chrome driver directly in, which is a weird thing that you pull down all these node packages and then you still have to run a command within that node module to then pull down Selenium and Chrome driver. Basic reason is that it needs to be updated and kept up to date, and they don't want to put that big giant thing into the npm package. So it's kind of a weird extra step you have to go through. You have to define where your specs are. Nothing new there. You define what your framework is, and then you can give. I'm using Jasmine, so you can give Jasmine a few extra things. An important one is this default timeout interval, and actually then we have an all scripts timeout slightly below it. You want to generally, the idea is that you put that in there, assuming that, sometimes because your computer's running a little slow, it's a little heavy when you're running it, maybe wherever you're running it's a little slow, give it the extra time to make sure the page loads. And usually this is gearing towards actual, like launching your app and getting that initial setup going. After that, it tends to move pretty smoothly, but this is to account for that. I found 30 seconds tends to work on my machine. Whatever number works for you is going to be fine. And then one of the neat things you can do is you can actually set up multiple capabilities. So you can have it set up so that your tests are going to run on, I just have it set up for Chrome and I'm calling it a desktop, and it's okay, the window size is 1200 by 1000. And I can also tell it where to initially position it. So I'm saying 0 to 50. Generally, when I'm actually doing this on my work computer, I have an extra monitor. I'll actually set it up so it runs on that other monitor because I have my code over here. So when I'm debugging it through PHP Storm, which, by the way, the JetBrains tools actually provide some really nice debugging for these end-to-end tests. If you're not using those, maybe hopefully you can find something for Sublime or whatever your thing is. But I will say JetBrains tools do a pretty good job of it. But this allows you to actually, configure that I want this guy to be this size and position him here and run the tests against there. And then I could also, as you notice, we got an array. In my real world, I also have it set up for tablet sizing, or at least what we call tablet sizing. Then I have one set up for mobile sizing. And it will launch, in this case, Chrome, in all of those different browsers, all at the same time. It'll launch a different browser window for each one of those sizes and run your test suite against those. So that way you can determine, okay, this works really great when I'm in a desktop mode where I have a ton of real estate, but all of a sudden I shrink it down and my page responds, and all of a sudden I have things moved in different positions, and maybe something's hidden, maybe something new is there. How's it going to react, and how is this test going to run? And same for mobile. I don't have it listed here, but it also gives you a way to define test suites so that you can say when you're in that situation, because you may have to write a different end-to-end test for a tablet or a mobile system, that you write an actual different spec for it, because it has to reconcile the fact that maybe a few controls aren't there, or they're moved and acting differently. So you can actually have it set up in that regard. Definitely check out the protractor documentation for that. It'll give you a nice little. It's very easy to say, a simple configuration. It's just not something I have listed here. So we have it all set up. Ooh, goodness. Oh, there we go. All right, so let's look at the actual code. This is that page I showed you where it just has, just that. This is just a code that's behind it. Important to notice is we have things. We have divs that have classes on them. We have inputs that have ng models on them. We have a button somewhere. We have a button that has text in it. These are things that Protractor allow you to find beyond what normally you get out of the WebDriver that underpins all of this. So based on that, I can actually come in and say, when I'm trying to find these, I can actually do, it's a by function. It's their locator service. They can actually say by model and tell it what that is, and it will be able to find that. Now, if you have multiples on your screen, then you have to deal with it slightly differently. But if it's only a one-off, then you can just say, give me that, and it will go out and find it. And then with buttons, you can say, okay, if it's a button that you are going to be modifying the text of, maybe adding or removing or whatever, it'll actually give you a way to say, okay, the full text or the partial text. Definitely check out the docs. Their API docs are not fabulous, but they will get you the information you need. And then what they recommend for Protractor end-to-end testing is that you actually configure page objects. And this is very much a node type of situation. If you notice at the very bottom, we have a module exports. What this does is you can actually take this user's page and you can pull out all the things that define that page. So in this case, really all I'm caring about is just that big collection of users, so that big listing. And I just use it, and I can actually do that by the repeater. I can say, oh, the repeater is user in user, so that's your ng repeat. That will find the element or all the elements inside of there and give those back to me so I can access them later. And then I can do a get, which will allow me to say, okay, this is where I want it. This is what the page address is. I can then have functions that perform things on this user, so I can get the count. I can also go through and try to find a particular one by the name. One thing you'll notice is I'm returning everything. Also, this is a big chain of asynchronous code. Protractor, when it first calls that, when that first gets hit, it doesn't actually go out on your page and parse everything and grab it and then give it to you, because things on your page can change, and maybe you want you're writing your test so that you're expecting it to be in a state that it's at when you're hitting it, not when the page was initially constructed. So this will basically this is just giving back promises that then when you actually try to use them, that's when they get reconciled. It makes the code very, very nasty, and the whole callback hell that you can get in JavaScript and especially in Node. This is where it really comes into play when you're doing these end-to-end tests. But that being said, the fact that this will actually be an independent file that you can run, an independent JS file. It makes it so much easier when all of a sudden you can pull this definition into a separate file, and then you just do a require wherever you need it. So you write it once, reuse it everywhere. It's kind of what programming and development is supposed to be about. And here you can even see I have a control that's called user row that actually references the individual row of each user. Here's the kicker. In end-to-end testing, this is fine. You can do this all day, every day with this whole require functionality and everything, because Chrome and Firefox and Safari and probably IE, but who knows, they do whatever they want. They support require. So you can actually use, and this function is there, and you can use it, and it gives you this really beautiful functionality. When I encounter this, I'm like, oh, I want to put that back into my unit testing, my integration testing, because I have all of these definitions for HTTP calls that I would like to be able to just write in these very discrete ways and make it a lot easier to read my code and also write it later. Unfortunately, Phantom.js does not support require. It doesn't have it. So you would have to then try to find some third party, and I found some examples that they claim would do all this and that, and I could never get it to work. So unfortunately, for unit testing and integration testing, if you want to use Phantom.js, you can't take advantage of that. But because you can't, well, theoretically, you probably could figure out how to use Phantom.js for end-to-end testing, but it doesn't make as much sense because it's headless. But because you're not going to be using it, you can use require, and it helps clean up your code. Just kind of a hopefully helpful tip. Configuring a row, as I mentioned, I was able to require that in the standard Node way. Here is just pulling in, I have the element, which is actually what defines that. That's the top level of that row that encompasses the entire outside thing of that DOM. And then I can start pulling things out of it. The checkbox and name, are they awesome or not? And then that link for editing. And the linking is kind of nice too, because you can say, okay, find that thing based on what's in its link, what the text is of that link. Provided you don't have that many of those links, it can make it very easy. And then the different things I want to do: select a user, which is clicking the checkbox, getting the name, are they awesome, and then clicking the link at the edit link. If you notice, the clicking is very simple. You just call click. But once again, I'm returning everything because all of these are returning promises. So whenever you're using them, call back hell. You're constantly having to you can't just call something and assume it's going to happen right away. Sometimes it does. I've actually gotten into problems where I've written some code, some test code, and a couple of times it works, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. And I'm looking through trying to figure out what's going on, and go, oh, okay, I have to react to the actual promise response from this particular element. the test script itself. So what this is doing is this is actually editing a user. So it's going to go in and it's going to pull that list of users, and it's going to pull this list, find Pete Clody, and then it's going to go over and click that edit button. So I come in, I first need my users page. I have to construct it. So in this case, it's node, so you're doing new users page. And that's going to then pull whatever's in the DOM and start processing it and parsing it. And you better be on the users page or else it's not going to work. So provided we're on the users page, we're going to say get user by name. So now it's going to try to find that row element. It's then going to, okay, wait until that responds because it's a promise and you have to go through callbacks. It gets a success, users of name. So it's going to find all the because it's a filter, it's going to find all of the users. I kind of know that it's only that the users are unique. So it's going to only return the one. So I'm just saying, it's an array. Give me the first one. I'm wrapping it as a user row. And then I'm clicking the edit link. So I click the edit link. That's also a promise. That's an asynchronous call. When that returns properly, I then need to say, okay, now I expect to be on the user page. Not the users page, but the user page. So I need to construct that page. That page also I've defined in the same way I did the users page in a different node module. That then goes out and parses everything that's in the DOM and pulls everything that it makes sense to be that page. Comes through, where am I at? User page. It then, first name, which is an input box, it says, okay, change that to Peter John. Then wait until that comes back because that's a promise. All of a sudden you got another callback. And then you got, okay, commit user value. So this is just clicking the button. That's a promise. So you got to wait for that to come back. Then you're saying, okay, now I'm back on the users page. So I have to reconstruct that. And you reconstruct that users page. Then you say, okay, now I want to validate that, I want to find a user who there should be a user named Peter John Clody. Well, that's a promise as well. So you wait until that guy comes back, and then you say, okay, now I can do my expect. I finally can get to the point of actually validating this test. Did it do what I expect, which is users of name length Peter John Clody to be greater than 0, basically meaning I found one. And that is all of that code to do that one expect. And then you can see all of these lovely little curly braces showing how many nested layers of callbacks we had to deal with. Here's my caveat. I haven't been writing end-to-end tests for very long. It's possible that you can optimize the hell out of this and make this much cleaner and better. I say you should. If it's possible, go for it, do it. Don't try to mimic that. That is just the best methodology I've been able to find in the short time I've had doing end-to-end testing. But guess what? Finally, we're done. Almost. Okay, there we go. We are going to watch an end-to-end test that as long as, the server's going to crash. I'll guarantee you that because it's been crashing every time I run it. But this is effectively what you see when you run end-to-end tests. Oh, yep, it failed. They're not the fastest thing. I mean, this is a very simple thing that's going on. My end-to-end test for my real production app takes, I can't remember how many tests I have, maybe 20, and it takes about 2 to 3 minutes. And that's just running Chrome as a desktop type thing. It's not a fast process because it's loading pages, it's waiting, giving that timeout possibility. It's clicking buttons, it's doing this, it's routing, it's doing things at a user level, so it's just slower because it is waiting for pages to actually come back and load, which is also what Protractor gives you. It can sit there and it actually knows to wait for things. It knows enough about Angular to know that okay, this is happening now, let's wait for this page to load, let's wait for this to happen. So, once again, that's it. Finally. A lot of information. It went for a really long time. Some of it may be useful. Some of it may be complete. Oh, all right. Well, I went really long. God bless it. If you have a question, feel free to ask. If you just want to go the hell home, feel free. I will not be offended. All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
So back to the fixtures thing. I'm coming from a Django world. I'm more of a server-side developer and just starting to get into more front-end development.
Okay.
So in Django, when I write tests, I can write fixtures very similar to how you had showed us the fixture. So you have a JSON object or a first-class JavaScript object where you define your fixture data, so your user data in your case.
Yes.
One thing that I found while working on JSON files describing the fixture data, sometimes the objects get large, you have a lot of information, and if your models change, then you have to go and edit all of your fixture data, and that can be kind of cumbersome.
Yes.
So then we start to get more to an approach of like manually creating, or not, automatically creating the fixture data. Are there recommended ways of doing that using in Angular as well, instead of doing a?
Not that I am aware of. Generally, whenever I've been dealing with any of this fixture data, as you're referring to, it's pretty much been very much ad hoc. You just, you have to build it manually, and as things change, you have to go back and change them. I'm not sure, maybe Jay, if you have any knowledge of. Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't. Yeah, between the two of us, we don't know of a good way to help generate that or deal with that. I mean, you could always look into the possibility. I mean, the biggest problem you run into with, as I mentioned when I got into the end-to-end testing, that if you're dealing with large pieces of data like that, it's possible maybe you could have a simple NoSQL server out there that's going to give you back some very pretty JSON, or even just MySQL with a very thin front end that you could call from somewhere and pull that data. But you'd have to if you're doing unit integration testing that is relying on with PhantomJS, yeah, you have to make sure that it's something that you actually are capable of connecting to, or maybe you build it into your test suite or into your build process for your testing, so that when you can have a special thing that you can run that will pull all this data down and store it into a location that then you can access. And that way, if you ever need to change it, you can change it in one singular location and pull it from that way. But you'd have to start getting into some pretty interesting ways of connecting to that system to pull that data. But as far as any real interesting generation, not that I'm aware of. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I do apologize for going so long, but there's a lot to be talked about for unit testing, and it quite honestly, I didn't even feel like I got close to what I should be talked about. But it's a very huge topic, just for testing in general. But thank you all for coming.
If you guys have any ideas of any other topics too for the AngularJS group, like if you want to know anything else, let us know and we'll put something together. Try to do it every other month. I'm not serving Angular 2.0, but I think he is. I've been switching to Aurelia for the next gen stuff.
What do you get for Django as far as automation goes? Like self-testing probably. Yeah. So take
Yeah, it was really
user model.
There we go. Fine.
Edge fix.
Oh, I can see if I recorded my